My name is Layla Osman. I am 32 years old. And the Sunday afternoon my father held up my manuscript in the living room on Harwick Road and asked who was going to read it. Was the afternoon I understood that the people who shaped you will sometimes look at the thing you made from that shaping and not recognize themselves in it at all. He had found it on the coffee table. I had left it there while I went to get water from the kitchen, which I had done without thinking, the way you stop being careful about things in the house where you grew up. When I came back, he was standing with the stack of pages in both hands, not reading, holding it the way you hold something you are about to weigh. He said, "Who is going to read this?" He said it genuinely as a question, not as a dismissal, which made it worse in a specific way I am still thinking about. He said, "Put this energy into your actual career." My brother Tarek was on the sofa with his phone. He looked up, looked at the manuscript, looked at me, and said, "Dad's not wrong, Layla." He said it with the mild certainty of someone endorsing a position they haven't examined. My mother was in the armchair by the window. She said nothing. She picked up her tea. The quiet she chose was not neutral. It was the particular quiet of someone who has an opinion and has decided, for reasons of her own, that this is not the moment to offer it. I crossed the room. I took the manuscript from my father's hands. I held it against my side, pages down, the way you carry something you are not going to explain. I said, "I should get going." I hugged my mother. I nodded to Tarek. I kissed my father on the cheek the way I had done since I was 4 years old, and I walked out to my car, and I drove the 26 minutes back to my apartment on Selborne Street. What no one in that living room knew, what I had told no one in my family, and only 2 people outside it, was that 3 weeks earlier, my literary agent Nadia Reyes had called me at 7:43 in the morning to tell me that Caldwell and Shore, an independent literary publisher with a 30-year list and a reputation for the kind of fiction I had spent 6 years trying to write, had made an offer on my novel. The announcement was not yet public. I had not called my father. I had not called my mother. I had driven to Harwick Road for a regular Sunday visit with 340 pages of the book on the coffee table and said nothing, and then my father had picked it up, and now I was driving home on the expressway with the manuscript on the passenger seat and 5 weeks left before the world would know what he was holding. I turned on the radio. I drove carefully. I did not call anyone. The novel was called The Distance from Aden. It was a work of historical fiction, 341 pages in its final form, set across 2 timelines, one following a Somali family's departure from Aden in 1967 during the political upheaval before South Yemeni independence, and one following their granddaughter, a woman my age, reconstructing that departure from fragmentary documents and her grandmother's memory 50 years later. It was, in other words, more or less the story of my own family, written in the third person with names changed and certain facts rearranged, and the particular compression that fiction allows when you are trying to get at something that nonfiction cannot reach by direct approach. I want to be precise about why I wrote it in that form and not another, because the form was itself a decision that my father specifically objected to, though he did not know the book well enough to frame the objection that way. He knew I had been working on a writing project for several years. He knew I had a day job. I worked as a policy analyst at a regional urban planning consultancy called Meridian Group, a position I had held for 4 years that paid me $67,000 annually and that I was, by most measures, genuinely good at. He knew I wrote in the evenings and on weekends. What he had constructed from those facts was a picture of a hobby that had grown out of proportion, time and attention going into something that could not justify the allocation by any measurement he recognized. My father was an engineer. He had come to this country at 26 with a master's degree from a university in Mogadishu, whose name American institutions did not recognize, and he had spent 3 years taking courses at a state university to establish credentials that would allow him to work in his field, and he had built a career over 30 years in civil engineering that was defined by the particular discipline of making things that held. Bridges, drainage systems, retaining walls. Things with load tolerances and inspection reports and consequences for failure that were legible and immediate. He respected things that could be measured. He respected things that held. Fiction, in his framework, was not a thing that held. It was not a thing you measured. The question he had asked, "Who is going to read this?" was not rhetorical cruelty. It was a genuine engineering inquiry. What is the load-bearing structure of this endeavor? What holds it up? Who needs it to exist and why? And how do you know? He was applying the only evaluative framework he fully trusted to something that did not operate within that framework, and the result was a question that felt like a dismissal, but was actually something more complicated and, in its own way, more difficult to answer. I had been trying to answer it for 6 years. I began the novel at 26, 2 years after my grandmother Huyo Fatuma died. Huyo Fatuma had been the primary keeper of the family's departure story, the specific account of how my grandfather Hassan had decided, in the spring of 1967, that the political situation in Aden was not going to stabilize, and had arranged within 3 weeks for the family to leave. 4 children, 1 trunk of documents and photographs. A decision made in the compressed time that historical situations sometimes impose on ordinary people, without ceremony or the benefit of knowing how the story ends. I had grown up with pieces of this story, fragments from Huyo Fatuma's telling, which was not linear and not consistent, and which changed in small ways each time she told it, the way oral history does when it is held in a single person's memory for 50 years. After she died, I found, in the boxes my aunt brought from her apartment, a collection of documents I had not known existed, letters in Arabic, a ship manifest, a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood in Aden where the family had lived, 3 photographs. I took the boxes home to my apartment on Selborne Street and spent 3 weeks reading everything with a dictionary beside me for the Arabic and a notebook for the things I could not translate but could describe. I called my father twice during those 3 weeks. He told me what he remembered of the crossing, which was very little. He had been 6 years old, and what he retained was sensory rather than narrative. The smell of the ship's engine, the specific quality of light on the water at a certain time of day, his mother's hand on his shoulder at the railing. These were not the materials of an argument or an account. They were the materials of a novel. I took a 2-week leave from the job I had at the time, a junior analyst position at a city planning office, and went to London, where a community of Somali families who had left Aden in the same period had settled, and I spent 9 days conducting recorded interviews with 4 elderly men and women who had been adults during the departure, and who were willing to speak with me. A librarian at the British Library named Callumshire helped me access a collection of digitized documents from the colonial period that included administrative records of departures from Aden Harbour in 1967. I found my grandfather's name in a ship manifest. I sat in the reading room of the British Library with my notebook and the digitized manifest on a screen, and looked at his name for a long time. I came home and started writing. The first draft took 2 years. I wrote it in the mornings before work, from 5:30 to 7:15, and on Sunday afternoons when I was not at Harwick Road. I had no particular plan for what the draft would become. I was writing to understand the departure, to make it hold in a way that Huyo Fatuma's fragmentary telling had not, and it was only at the end of the first draft, at 280 pages, that I understood I had written something that wanted to be a book and not just a document for my own understanding. I took the draft to my friend Preeti Nair, who had an MFA in creative writing and who read it over a weekend and called me on a Sunday evening and talked to me for 90 minutes about what she saw in it, the structural problems, the places where the historical and contemporary timelines failed to speak to each other, the scenes that were doing more than I had intended them to do, and the scenes that were doing less. Preeti was not gentle. She was useful, which is different, and I had asked her to be useful rather than gentle. I spent 8 months on the second draft. I cut 60 pages. I restructured the contemporary timeline entirely. I wrote a new opening chapter 4 times before I found the version that worked, the one that begins with the granddaughter finding the ship manifest in a box that has been in her mother's garage for 20 years, which is not exactly what happened to me, but is close enough that people who know my family will recognize it and different enough that it is fiction rather than memoir. The second draft was what I sent to Nadia Reyes. Nadia had been my agent for 8 months before the sale. I had found her through a submission process that had taken 14 months, 81 queries to literary agents, 37 of whom had requested either a partial or a full manuscript, 6 of whom had made it to the stage of a phone call, and 1 of whom, Nadia, had called me on a Wednesday morning and said, "I've read it twice. The second time I read it, I understood what you were doing in the structure. I'd like to represent it." I was at my desk at Meridian Group when the call came in. I took it in the stairwell. After the call ended, I went back to my desk and spent 20 minutes staring at the urban traffic flow model I had been analyzing before the call, and then I sent Preeti a text that said, "Agent,
Call me tonight."
she replied in 30 seconds with a string of characters I interpreted as celebration. I did not tell my family. The reasoning was the same reasoning I had applied for 6 years. The book was not finished becoming itself yet, and the people in my family had a way of engaging with things in progress that involved applying their own evaluative frameworks to something that did not yet have the completed evidence to push back against those frameworks. My father would ask practical questions, the answers to which were not yet knowable. My mother would worry. Tark would say something mild and endorsing of whoever had spoken last. I needed all of them to wait until there was something concrete enough that the questions had answers. Nadia submitted to publishers in November. The submission went to 11 houses. I knew the names of all 11. I tracked the rejections as they came in, 4 in the first 3 weeks, 2 more in the following month, with the particular attention of someone who has decided that the information is useful and the feeling is not. By January, we were at 5 remaining. By February, 3. In March, Nadia called at 7:43 a.m. She said, "Caldwell and Shore came in this morning. I want to walk you through the offer before you say anything." She walked me through it. It was a 2-book deal, The Distance from Aden, and an option on a second novel. The advance for the first book was $87,000 to be paid in 3 installments. The publication timeline was 18 months from contract signing. I said, "Yes." She said, "I know. I'm going to counter on 1 point, and then we'll close. Don't tell anyone for a few weeks. Caldwell wants to control the announcement through their publicity team." I said, "I understood." I did not tell anyone. I drove to Harwick Road 3 weeks later for a regular Sunday visit and left my manuscript on the coffee table, and my father picked it up and asked who was going to read it, and I kissed him on the cheek and drove home. The announcement was made on a Thursday morning, 8 weeks after the offer, in a segment on a national public radio program called The Book Hour. Caldwell and Shore had a relationship with the program. They announced several acquisitions per year through it, a deliberate publicity strategy that their publicist, a woman named Fiona Bragg, had explained to me in a preparatory call 2 weeks before the broadcast. Fiona told me the segment would be approximately 4 minutes. She told me they would use a brief excerpt from the novel's opening chapter. She told me the host, a man named Robert Calloway who had been with the program for 11 years, would read the announcement and then spend 2 minutes discussing the book's subject with a senior editor at Caldwell. She asked if I had any concerns. I said no. She said, "Is there anyone who might hear it before you've had a chance to call them? Family, colleagues?" I was quiet for 1 second. I said, "Possibly my father. He listens to the program on Sunday mornings, but the segment is Thursday, so he'll hear it on the podcast version on Sunday." She said, "Do you want to call him Thursday morning before it goes live?" I said, "No." She waited a moment. She said, "Okay."
She did not ask why.
I appreciated that. The segment aired Thursday at 10:17 in the morning. I was at my desk at Meridian Group. I had my headphones in and the program's live stream open in a browser tab behind my work documents. I listened to Robert Calloway read the announcement, the title, my name, the subject of the book, the deal structure in general terms, the publication timeline, and then listened to him and the Caldwell editor discuss the historical period and the structure of the dual timeline for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Then I closed the browser tab and went back to the traffic flow model. My phone began registering activity at 10:26. Nadia texted first, "It's live. Congratulations properly now." Preeti sent a voice message I did not listen to until lunch. 2 colleagues at Meridian Group who listened to the program, I had not known they listened, appear at my desk within an hour, which I had not anticipated and which required me to explain, briefly and without particular ceremony, that yes, this was the same novel they had occasionally heard me mention, and yes, the deal was real. My father listened to the podcast version on Sunday morning, as he did every week, while he drank his coffee at the kitchen table on Harwick Road. He called me at 9:51. I let the first call go, not because I was not ready to talk to him, but because I was in the middle of something and I wanted to finish it first. I was in my second bedroom, which I used as a writing space, working on the opening pages of the second novel, The one the contract optioned, which I had been thinking about for a year and writing toward for 3 months. I finished the paragraph I was in the middle of. I saved the document. I called him back. He answered before the first ring completed, which was unusual. My father was not a person who hovered over his phone. He said, "Layla." I said, "Hi, Baba." A pause. He said, "I heard the program this morning." I said, "I know." He said, "Robert Calloway." I said, "Yes." He said, "He read from it. The first page." I said, "The opening chapter. The ship manifest scene." A long pause. Longer than I expected. He said, "That's the manifest. From Julio Fatima's boxes." I said, "A version of it." I changed some details. He said, "Hassan is my father's name." I said, "I know. I kept his name." Another pause. I heard him set something down on the table. A cup, by the sound of it. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I had thought about this answer for 8 weeks, not continuously but regularly, the way you think about something you know is coming. I said, "Because the last time I had the manuscript in your house, you asked who was going to read it. And I didn't have an answer yet that would have meant anything to you. I needed to wait until the answer was Robert Calloway." He was quiet, long enough that I looked at my phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. He said, He stopped. He tried again. "That's a fair answer." I said, "I know you weren't trying to be unkind. I know you were asking a real question." He said, "I was asking if it was serious." I said, "I know." He said, "It's serious." I said, "Yes, Baba, it's serious." Another pause. He said, "The manifest scene." Robert Calloway said the historical research was, he used a word. A brief silence. Meticulous. He said meticulous. I said, "I spent 9 days in London. The British Library. A librarian named Callum helped me find the departure records." He said, "You found the actual manifest." I said, "I found the digitized record. Your father's name on the ship manifest for the crossing in April 1967. Very still on his end." "Then, you didn't tell me that either." I said, "No." He said, "When?" I said, 7 years ago. Before I started writing." He said the name. Just my grandfather's name, quietly, the way you say a name when you're not talking to the person but about them, and the saying of it is itself the whole statement. I said, "I know." We stayed on the phone for another 22 minutes. He asked about the structure of the dual timeline. He asked about the London interviews, and I told him about the 4 elderly people who had been adults in Aden in 1967 and had agreed to speak with me, and he asked their names and I told him, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said that one of the names, an old man named Ibrahim Warsame, had been a neighbor of his parents on the street in Aden before the departure. He said this with a particular stillness that I recognized as something being revised in real time. He said, "He's still alive?" I said, "He was 7 years ago. I don't know now." He said, "You spoke to Ibrahim Warsame, and you didn't tell me." I said, "I didn't know yet what the book was going to be. I didn't know if it was going to be anything. I was still learning what I was doing." He said, "What did he say?" "About the crossing." I said, "He said your father was the most organized man he had ever watched make a decision in an emergency. He said Hassan had a list. He said everyone on that street was still talking about the list 2 days after you had all gone." The silence that followed that was different from the earlier silences. Longer. Fuller. He said, "My father had a list." I said, "He did." He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "I know. That's why I went to London." Tarek called that evening, after my father had presumably spoken to him. He said, "I heard the radio thing." I said, "I know." He said, "Dad told me." A pause. I said the wrong thing. That Sunday. I said, "You said what you thought." He said, "I said what Dad said." That's not the same thing as what I thought. A longer pause. I actually didn't know enough about it to think anything. I went with the room. I said, I know. He said, is it a real thing? Like, is this actually happening?
I said, 18 months.
Caldwell and Shore. Robert Calloway read from the opening chapter on national radio. He said, yeah. A pause. Yeah, okay. Then, can I read it? The manuscript. Can I read it before it publishes? I said, when it goes into copy editing, I'll send you a clean version. He said, okay. Another pause. Layla. I said, yeah. He said, the family stuff. The departure. Is it? He stopped. Started again. Is it hard to read? If you're in the family? I said, it's honest. Whether that's hard depends on the person. He said, okay. He said it with something in it that I recognized as preparation rather than dismissal. He said, okay. Send it when it's ready. I said I would. My mother called on a Tuesday, 2 days after my father, and the evening after Tarek. She called in the late afternoon, which was unusual. She preferred mornings. I picked up on the second ring. She said, I've been thinking about what to say since Sunday. I said, take your time. She said, I was quiet that afternoon, when Baba had the pages. I said, I know. She said, I want you to know why. A pause. I've read your writing before. When you were in university. The pieces you published in the student journal. I knew it was serious. I've known for a long time that it was serious. Another pause. I was quiet because I didn't think my saying something would change what Baba said, and I didn't want to start an argument in the living room, and I think, she stopped. I think I should have said something anyway. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry I didn't. I said, I know why you didn't, and I know you knew. She said, Robert Calloway read from it. I listen on Baba's phone on Sunday morning. A pause. The grandmother character. The way she describes the decision to leave. Another pause. That's Hoyo Fatuma. I said, a version of her. She said, she sounds exactly like herself. I said, I had 2 weeks with her notebooks. And your memory. You told me things about her over the years that she never told me directly. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to read the whole thing. I said, I'll send you what I sent Tarek, when it's in copy editing. She said, before then. I said, Mom. She said, please, before then. A pause. She was my mother-in-law for 31 years. I want to read it before it belongs to everyone. I thought about that for a moment. The manuscript was in its final pre-copy editing form. Fiona Bragg had it, the Caldwell editorial team had it, Nadia had it. One more reader was not a structural problem, and my mother had known it was serious when my father did not. I said, I'll send it this week. She said, thank you. We stayed on the phone for another 10 minutes. She asked about the London trip, which she had not known about, and I told her about the reading room at the British Library and the digitized manifest and my grandfather's name in the ship records, and she listened without interrupting, which she did not always do, and when I finished she said, he would have been so, and then she stopped and did not finish the sentence, and I did not ask her to. The Distance from Aden published 14 months after the contract signing, in the spring. The publication was quiet in the way that first novels from independent publishers tend to be quiet, not invisible but not loud. There were reviews in 4 publications I had hoped for, and 2 I had not expected. Robert Calloway's program ran a second segment on the day of publication, a 6-minute conversation between me and the host, which I participated in from a studio in the city. My father listened to it live, not on the podcast delay. He texted me immediately after. Good interview. You didn't say anything wrong. I read that text sitting in the car in the parking structure outside the recording studio and understood it, having known my father for 32 years, as the highest praise he knew how to give in a text message. Preethi organized a small publication dinner at a restaurant on Holbrook Avenue. 8 people, the people who had been in the room with the book in various ways during the 6 years it took to make it. My father came. He sat across from Preethi and spent most of the dinner asking her about the MFA program she had attended, the specific courses, the faculty, the reading lists. He was conducting an investigation into the field, the way he conducted investigations into anything he had previously underestimated. I watched him do it and did not intervene. At one point during dinner, he picked up the copy of the book that was on the table. The finished thing, not the manuscript, the actual printed book with the cover and the spine and his father's name in the acknowledgments, and looked at it the way he had looked at the manuscript on Harwick Road, which was with a kind of structural assessment, evaluating the weight of it, the load-bearing capacity of its components. The difference was that this time, he had listened to Robert Calloway. He knew what held it up. He set it back down on the table carefully, in the same position it had been. He said nothing. He picked up his fork. He continued his investigation of Preethi's reading lists. That was enough. That has always been enough. The second novel is now in its second draft. It is set in the same world as the first, a different generation, a different geography, a different kind of departure. I am writing it in the mornings before work, which is still my pattern, still 5:30 to 7:15, still the same apartment on Selborne Street with the second bedroom I use as a writing space. The window faces east. The light comes in early. My father calls on Sunday mornings after his program ends. He calls to tell me what he thought about whatever was discussed that week, which is to say, he has started paying attention to the program the way he pays attention to things he has decided are worth tracking. He occasionally asks about the second novel, practical questions, engineering questions, the load-bearing structure of the new project, and I answer them as honestly as I can, which is sometimes with a real answer and sometimes with the honest version, which is that I don't know yet what holds this one up. He accepts that answer now.
He did not used to.
Nadia says the option clause on the second book is still active and that Caldwell would like to see the draft when it is ready. I told her it would be ready when it was ready. She said she knew. She has been my agent long enough to know that I mean it when I say that, and that I will deliver it when the thing is actually finished rather than when someone else's timeline says it should be. Huyo Fatuma's boxes are in my second bedroom, on a shelf above the desk where I write. The ship manifest is in a frame on the wall, not the original, which I found only as a digitized record in the British Library, but a printed copy of the scan, at the resolution that shows my grandfather's handwriting in the column where passengers were permitted to add a notation. He had written, in Arabic, a word that Callum Shire translated for me in the reading room that afternoon. The word was prepared. My grandfather had boarded a ship in April 1967 with 4 children and 1 trunk, leaving behind everything that did not fit in that trunk, and in the column where passengers could write a notation, he had written prepared. As though he wanted whoever read the manifest to know that the decision, though made in 3 weeks under pressure, had been made with full attention and without panic. I think about that word every morning when I sit down to write. Here is what I have come to understand, at 32, after 6 years and 341 pages, and a second draft already underway. The thing you make from your family story does not belong to them. It belongs to the work, to the structure you built, the research you did, the decisions about what to keep and what to change, and what to compress into a form that reaches people who are not there. Your family will recognize themselves in it, and they will find things in it they did not know were there, and some of them will tell you it sounds exactly like the person you were both trying to describe. That is the work doing what the work is supposed to do. You do not write to correct anyone's assessment of whether the work is serious. You write because the story is there, and the gap between what was lived and what has been recorded is real, and someone has to be the person who sits in a reading room in London and finds a name in a ship manifest and understands that the notation in the margin is the whole story. My grandfather wrote prepared. I have been thinking about that word for 7 years. I will probably be thinking about it for the rest of my life. That is what serious work looks like from the inside. Here is what I want to ask you before you go. On the Sunday morning, my father listened to Robert Calloway read from the opening chapter of my novel, sitting at the kitchen table on Harwick Road with his coffee, not knowing the book was already in the world, not knowing I had been in the British Library 7 years before and found his father's name. Do you think what he felt in that moment was pride? Or do you think what he felt first was the particular discomfort of recognizing that he had been wrong and that the two things are not the same and do not arrive at the same time? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. A new story posts every week. And if you know someone whose work has been called an embarrassing waste by someone who loved them, share this with them. Sometimes the only answer that matters is the one that comes through someone else's radio on a Sunday morning. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week.